go live, I'll just do a quick introduction. We'll play a video by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's son, Ken. And then Faye, I'll hand over to you.
Live on Facebook.
So Smriti, I was thinking instead of doing like a clear handover now, we should just stay in it together. It'll just make it faster and like, you know, it won't seem like such a formal thing.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay. All right. Gina, you will need to let us know.
Yeah. Shreya,
Okay.
Start webinar, please.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Smriti. I'm the Director of Programs in Pallium, India, and I head the policy division as well as strategic partnerships and community engagement. And I'm really delighted to have all of you over at this session today. Exactly a year ago, we had another webinar, and Faye was with us then as well. And at that time, we had talked about how important it was to really acknowledge grief, death, and dying. It was when we were still finding our feet after the first lockdown in India, and we had a sense of how bad things could get. Of course, when we thought that things were getting better, we were then we experienced the second wave. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that all of us have experienced grief and loss in some way or form since then, some more than others. Today is a special day because today commemorates the 17th death anniversary of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Elizabeth is somebody who all of us, not just in palliative care circles, but worldwide, are quite familiar with. We're familiar with her work. She's the first lady, the first person to really talk about death and dying in a compassionate way, and also talked about the 5 stages of grief, which have become, a benchmark of sorts. So today we are going to be talking about aspects of grief that we don't hear about very often from communities and demographics that don't usually have a platform to really come and express what grief looks like and feels like to them. So I'm very pleased to have with us today Dr. Alka Ganesh, who is a geriatrician and somebody I have a great deal of regard for. Helen Issar, who is a dear friend and somebody who's been in the education space a long time, is passionate about education, has 2 little children of her own, and has become a mother for the second time during the pandemic. Kumam Davidson, who joins us from Manipur, who is a really powerful voice in queer grief, and is here to represent the LGBTQI community, a community that has been historically marginalized, but more and more all of us acknowledge and respect, have their own experience of grief that the rest of us maybe are not at all familiar with. And of course, our dear friend Faye D'Souza, who really needs no introduction. So before we go into the session, I'm going to ask our tech team to play for you a message that we have from Elizabeth's son, Ken. Ken is a longtime friend of Pallium India's and of the palliative care community worldwide. So we'll first start with that before we go into the session. So Shreya, over to you for that, please.
Hello, this is Ken Ross of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. I'd like to speak to you today for a few moments on the 17th anniversary of my mother's passing, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Elizabeth said, of course, there's no one way to grieve properly. There's no one model for everybody. Everyone's grief is unique. But obviously, as human beings, there's also commonalities in our grief. And if we look through these commonalities, we can find ways to help each other through grief, ourselves as well as others. For example, Elizabeth liked to talk about the 4 quadrants: the emotional quadrant, the intellectual quadrant, the physical quadrant, and the spiritual quadrant. Finding balance in these 4 quadrants helps us get through grief, or helps our friends, loved ones, neighbors get through their grief. So we have to find ways in which we can externalize this grief and find a balance between these 4 emotions. Another way to deal with grief is through allowing yourself the pain of loss. Bottling it up, keeping it to yourself is not healthy over the long run. Externalization was very important in Elizabeth's work. She ran workshops called Life, Death, and Transition Workshops, and she found it was very important for us to externalize our grief through healthy means. A certain amount of anger was fine. A certain amount of externalization was great. So it's very important that we let out the grief and allow it to be processed outside of ourselves. We can't bottle up the grief. It's very important to forgive ourselves. Of course, we're going to have regrets that we had with our loved ones who've passed. We're going to have things that we wish we said, things that we didn't said, unfulfilled wishes, but this is natural. Life is not perfect, and we have to be able to forgive ourselves. We have to find ways of continuing a relationship with someone who's left us. Of course, relationships continue. After the person's lost to us physically, we still have a relationship with them. We have to be patient with ourselves. We have to allow natural healing, not force things that are unnatural, but there's ways to express this in a healthy manner. It's great to find a grief therapist if you can, or different ways to learn about how to process grief. It could be through books. It could be through physical exercise, biking, yoga, meditation. There are various ways to do it. We can also find creative outlets such as art, journaling, many different things. So keep in mind there's many paths to finding some kind of peace in our grief. And it's important to explore these possibilities and explore the internet, explore our own feelings, and find balance with these 4 quadrants. So again, I'd like to thank you and wish you good luck on your grief journey. And I'd like to thank all our friends at Pallium India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Ken is, like I had mentioned, an old friend of Pallium India's, and we're very glad that he was able to send that message across to us. So without any further ado, just getting right into what we are here to talk about. We have 1 hour and we have 3 wonderful people to hear from. So Faye, you were with us a year ago.
Yeah.
Talking about exactly the same thing, which I know is not really what you normally talk about. And here you are again. So thank you for coming and offering to moderate this session as well.
Well, Smriti, as you and Dr. Raj know, my services are always available to Pallium India. I'm such a big fan of the work you do and the consistency and dedication with which the entire organization does that work. And I think that if there's anything that any help or in any way we can lend our skills to making your life easier, all of us should do that. So on that note, just to recap, and I remember going through what we talked about last year because I felt that, I just wanted to refresh. And even though we were talking about grief, none of us could have assumed or imagined what lay in store for us in the beginning of this year. And I like the fact that you've picked the topic that you have, because grief actually creeps up in various ways. And in the last 1 year, we've lost friends, we've lost classmates, we've lost batchmates, we've lost neighbors, we've lost colleagues. Of course, there are families who lost one loved one, some cases more than one loved one. And we've also still all been bottled up from school, away from teachers, away from all of that development that normally comes. And we haven't paid attention to what that's doing to our children in India. Add to that the loss of the adults in their life. Add to that the fact that the adults in their life are depressed or going through grief or going through some stress of job loss. I mean, there is a mental health pandemic underway. I mean, we have to stop saying that it's coming. It's underway, and a large portion of that has to do with the fact that we haven't learned how to adequately deal with grief in our country in so many different ways. And that is why I think that these conversations are so extremely so important. I want to actually start off with Dr. Ganesh because, and this is anecdotal, a lot of the people my age have been telling me that their parents, who are completely fine technically, physically, other than the aging, have sort of dropped their shoulders in the last few months and sort of feel defeatist towards the whole thing, saying, okay, what's the point? We're just sitting around waiting for death to come to us. Because they've lost so many of their friends, they've lost so many people in their age group and their social circle. And I remember reading something that Dr. Ganesh had written, which is that it's, being elderly doesn't mean that you're too old to be happy. And are we running that risk right now of not caring about how our seniors are dealing with their grief, how they're dealing with their happiness, or are we just too preoccupied with staying alive that we've forgotten to ask?
Yes, apart from the COVID pandemic, Faye, the elderly come with so much of baggage that this pandemic has kind of just put them over the precipice, so to speak. So I want to really talk about the elderly as a whole and look at, we always wish as a good wish to people, may you live 100 years, but we never say, may you grow old. And they're the same, they're two sides of the same coin. And because being old, we all know, is being dependent, sick, frail, not quite having your marbles where they're supposed to be. And whereas growing old is one kind of a fantasy. And the grief of, being dependent and not having your cognition is, and then being a burden to everybody is very real. We can see it. But I thought I'd like to talk about the grief that is in people who look otherwise quite happy, who seem to have it all. They're living in families, but at the same time, life is not good. So I thought I would bring out one example, of course, of elder abuse. That's something which is awful to talk about. It's well researched. It's all over the world, different types of abuse, but it's hidden because the person who's abused can't talk about it. He's powerless. And he fears or she fears reprisal. And I'll just give you one example before you would like to move on. And that is, I was once asked by one of my patient's daughter, please come and see mom, because I used to do the home visits. She's got an awful rash on her face. It suddenly appeared. And I just asked her, is it on her left cheek? And she said, how did you know? I said, no, I'll just come and see. And it was on the left cheek, So that's where a right-handed person will slap a person, is on the left cheek. And then there were other bruise marks. And it was very clear that this person who had had a stroke and could not speak was being abused every day. And so this daughter said, now I know why she cries when I'm going for work. And then the carer said, but that's the only way I can make her eat this bowl of food. And then you begin to think all that you've read about elder abuse does not look at, have you looked at the abuser? We only heap recriminations. How can you do this? But if you look at carers, they have burnout. They need respite. They are not trained properly. So we have to get over this because an older person has the right to have that dignity of being well treated. So I think what we have to do is we have to tell carers that you will feel like hitting your patient. You will feel like doing this, and then empowering them to say, how will I not do this? And, so that's something which is not written about, but I think it's something we need to explore. So that is one kind of a hidden thing. It doesn't really carry on from what you said about the COVID, but, older people suffer in various ways within the families, and it's not acknowledged.
I think one of the things that, I'd like to sort of mention at this point is that when typically we talk about grief in the context of having lost somebody or, in the context of death. But I think it's also very important for all of us to acknowledge that grief can be felt even when that sort of thing doesn't occur. It could be the loss of something else. And here, very clearly, what happens when someone loses their sense of dignity, the one thing that you have left? You no longer have your autonomy because you're not the breadwinner. You don't have your mobility. You don't have your health, perhaps. Perhaps the last thing that people hold on to is their sense of dignity. And when that is taken away, the grief that goes with that is tremendous. And I think that's something that you've really touched upon quite clearly here, Alka.
Right, Smriti, that's actually really, really important. What happens also when, and then, silently, as Dr. Ganesh pointed out, when the person can't tell you what they're going through, they aren't able to communicate for whatever reason, the abuse or the pain or the loss of dignity that they're going through, what that sort of results in. And I want to, on that note, also bring in Kumam Davidson, who I know has stories to tell as well, specifically from the space that he operates in, the people that he works with. Kumam, we know that the last couple of years have been completely have been a lot worse for the members of the LGBTQI community. Could you tell us what you've experienced, what you're going through, what what people you've met are telling you right now?
I mean, it's quite all over the place, to be honest. And I want to, I think, begin by saying that, I mean, I thought about grief, since the last time I spoke to Smriti about this, and I kept thinking about it more often than I used to think about it. So then I realized that what is really grief in my context, from my understanding, from my lived experience, and I realized it's really this lack of expression, this lack of healing, and most importantly, I think from the context where I come from, I think it's also the lack of justice, because I grew up in the 90s in Manipur when armed conflict was at its peak, and there were deaths all over the place. There were widows from that time. So growing up as a kid, the violence, the grief, the death all around. So something as a repercussion from the armed conflict was something widely visible, something that we resisted as a young kid, seeing it all over. On the side was, HIV epidemic, wherein Manipur was one of the highest prevalent incident state, and so many people died of HIV/AIDS as well. And there was massive drug abuse in general, and also women who were raped, And in all of this, the grief that people had to went through, people had to go through, the families, loved ones, friends, and near and dear ones, I think was the lack of justice more than anything else. Yes, people were shouting, people were screaming, but I think the lack of justice was a very important component of why that grief never healed, why we kind of carry on that intergenerational trauma. But post 2000, when I grew up, when LGBTQI mobilization was getting to be visible, when we even learned to speak the word LGBTQ, I think that's when it's almost like we found a community, who never really seemed to have a life, who never really seemed to exist, whose life experiences never seemed to matter at all. So for the community, way back in the 90s and now, even during the pandemic, and I keep drawing this parallel because what really happened with the HIV epidemic, it was a pandemic, it was an epidemic for sure. But I think as much as we pay attention to the experiences of COVID-19, how that has impacted us physically and otherwise, and including, mental health, from mental health perspectives. I mean, I think there's so much conversation and yet never enough. But with HIV epidemics, I think the blame was put on LGBTQI population, especially trans people and gay, bisexual people. And I think the trauma of that kind of a blame, of to be, double stigmatized, to be twice tabooed, first because of your sexuality and then because of the virus, which in the case of COVID-19, I think it's different. I think the pain of this, the very impact of COVID-19 is, I think, widely acknowledged. But with HIV epidemic, no, it wasn't. I think people had to silently bear the brunt of all of it, not just your body decaying because of the virus, but also continued harassment in, hospitals, in clinics, in your society. So I think, for me, grief really begins with HIV epidemic in the 90s, which I saw as a young person, which I, then when I grew up, I began to engage with that as a community, issue, community concern. So what really happened during the COVID-19 in the last 1.5 years? I mean, I have been extensively speaking to different people across North India and also people from North India living in, Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, as part of a series called Pandemic Series, which is funded by Sathi India and also partially supported by University of California, Santa Barbara. So what I found in those, in this work in the last 10 months precisely is that, again, there is massive lack of silence, visibility for the community. Yes, there have been conversations in, in media here and there, but I think the narrative is still one of those tokenistic narrative where we don't really delve inside, where we don't really get to hear what the people have to really say. So, and we have been talking about relief kits for trans people, queer people, people living with HIV. So that sense of dignity, I mean, there is COVID-19 and suddenly there's a, 50 persons, standing in line, trans people standing in line to receive relief kit. I mean, great, there's some kind of support coming in, but we are also not speaking enough about dignity. What happens when we lose dignity time and again, in time and again, whenever there's a global health crisis, there's a global public health crisis. So dignity, justice, visibility. To be honest, I don't think the community as such still have that. We don't really have that articulation. We don't have that language. How do we even speak about our experience without necessarily being sort of framed in a very heteronormative paradigm? So I think through the pandemic series, through the community work that I think we're learning how to sort of articulate our grief, articulate our pain. And I think we're pretty much unclear as of now, because it's a very new conversation. And I mean, one of the flip sides of COVID-19 is that it allowed us to talk about mental health. It allowed us to talk about grief. Yes, it did sort of brought that platform and space and conversation. So I think we're trying to sort of also speak from our position, from our experiences. But just an example, today I had a conversation with Manipur State AIDS Control Society, and I was speaking with the assumption that some of the XYZ people there would have that sense of sympathy and empathy for the community, but the conversation went very brutal. It didn't work out. So this is just an example of how the community's experience voice tend to get really sort of silenced or questioned or completely brushed off. And I think I mean, even in 2021, after having worked with the community for so many years, I still think I am not able to articulate what grief means for us. I can only articulate what grief means for somebody who grew up in Manipur, yes, but for the community, I'm still very unsure how to speak about that. At the same time, I also don't want to speak on behalf of these trans people whose life experiences have been most vulnerable, and people who are living with HIV, people who died of AIDS, parents and friends and dear ones who sort of went through that trauma. I think I don't want to appropriate those voices as well. So I think individually speaking, I don't really have a very clear sense of what grief is for us, because it's pretty much silence for us so far. Yeah. Thank you.
I think the tapestry that you've just really woven is quite rich, and it just also highlights the fact that when we talk about COVID-19 and the losses that people have experienced, sometimes we don't see that there were people living with so many other issues to begin with, and this was just another thing, a massive monster that was overlaid on that. And I've mentioned this in another forum also, Faye, where a conversation with a friend who is a doctor, and she's a trans woman, and we were talking about access to essential medicines and how we were not able to. I was worried about not being able to get pain relief across to some of the patients, and she said, "What is an essential medicine to you is not necessarily an essential medicine to me. I need estrogen to make sure that my gender confirmation procedure does not get derailed." And it was even those of us, Kumam, I think it's who consider ourselves allies, sometimes fail to see some of the finer nuances of the struggles and the grief, even access to what so many of us take for granted. And there's a deep resounding loss in the fact that you have to fight for something that comes fairly easy to so many other people. And so thank you. Thanks for saying what you just said. Thanks for painting that picture.
Can I add a short line on that? So from
Please.
all
You're on mute, Kumam, sorry.
So from all the stories that I documented in the last 10 months, one example that kind of came out as you spoke about, that is that antiretroviral therapy, which is an essential medication for people living with HIV, is a medication that you cannot skip more than even not a night, right? So what happened with the continued lockdown and curfews in many states, including Manipur, was that a lot of people who were on ART, who are on ART, could not go to the hospital to get their ART for the next month because there was no transfer, because there was massive militarized checking all over the place, some of it completely unnecessary. And when a trans person is actually going out, they were forced to show their ART card, which means completely exposure of their status. And not only that, they could be, sort of pass on with slurs and things like that. You're a trans woman and you are like this. So complete loss of dignity, and also some people skipped ART, which means that the medication becomes autoimmune and it becomes resistant to the virus gets resistant. If you skip for 5 days or 7 days, likely to get resistant, and it means that your body won't react to the medicine anymore. So there are risks of this kind beside COVID-19, and this is something that the state as a fraternity did not take into account. So yeah, that's there. Thank you.
In fact, that was written about even in a city like Mumbai, where it's considered to be more accepting to some extent. One of the challenges that we faced specifically in the first wave of COVID in Mumbai was trans people who were put in government quarantine facilities had trouble with the other people in that facility who said, no, you can't use the women's washroom. And, we were not comfortable having a trans person in the women's section. And you had to be in quarantine. There was no other choice. And it was hugely traumatic for several people. I also want to bring in at this point our other guest and talk about children, because like I said, that there's a massive section of our population in children that we haven't fully paid attention to. Helen Issar is here. She works with children on a daily basis, has children of her own. Helen, in your opinion, what impact have the last couple of years had on children, especially when we talk about grief?
I think it's been quite devastating. So I work with the youngest. So I work with children from 1 year to 7 years. And I think that they really don't have a voice in all of this that's gone down in the last 2 years. I think while we sort of believe that this hasn't impacted them that much, there is a loss of routine. And I think the biggest part is a loss of childhood. They've all been exposed to too much of adult life far too fast. We've all been cooped up in homes. They're privy to all our phone calls, all our work discussions. They're privy to conversations as adults that on death and grief, on people dying, on someone's O2 levels, on how severe is someone's ICU status. And these are not conversations that any 4, 5, or 6-year-old should know. They're not even words a 5 or 6-year-old should have to deal with, right? So it's been particularly hard for them. And I think for them, that loss of childhood manifests in different ways. I've spoken to countless parents. I see it with this younger group. Food is this big topic. I mean, you will talk to any parent with a child in this age group. There's battles at the dining table. There's, none of them want to eat. It goes all the way to teenagers, parents struggling with saying, I can put anything on the table and a child doesn't want to eat. Food is something that is a social construct, right? We enjoy food because the people we eat it with. And if I'm missing my friends, if I'm missing that social part of it, what is the joy in eating food, right? And so many tantrums around food have manifested. And I believe that that's one way children are dealing with the grief and loss of this normalcy. There's a lot to do with not being able to meet their friends. School was a space that was their own and is a way to process a lot of what's going on in their home life, right? And that's gone. They would go there, they'd over lunch, you'd let it slip that I was upset with my mama, or something like this happened at home. They don't have those safe spaces anymore. We managed to construct them in some ways in our online play dates, as we call them, and suddenly, a child will let it slip that, oh, my grandmother passed away, or her O2 level was 60, and my parents said that she's not going to make it. And then when we spoke to the parent, we realized they actually had no clue the child had even overheard that conversation. And so children were processing grief and are processing grief on their own. I have my own 5, now 6-year-old, who I distinctly remember just one day went into the room, locked herself up, went under the blanket, switched off all the lights and says, I don't want to come out. I don't want to do an online class. I don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to talk to you. So there's that. And she had, of course, I had a baby this year, and she's had to deal with, while she would have been at school and not had to see how dependent a baby was and how much time it took from her own parents. She's seen a loss of her parents. She's seen, that quality of time that has gone away. And I think we've all been at home together. And so we believe we're with our children 24 hours, but there's no quality left in the time that we have with these little children. It's, there's a standing joke now when I say, oh, when mama says 1 second, she actually means 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes before she's able to attend to me, right? And across the board, parents will talk about children being rude, children saying things like, I want to leave the house, or I hate you and I never want to talk to you. And again, these are children who are 5 and 6 years. I don't remember saying that till I was a rebellious teenager. But I think that's all the way they're trying to tell you that they're struggling with the situation and they just want a sense of normalcy, and they miss their friends and they miss only having to see their parents 2 hours in a day, right?
But Helen, where's the solution to that? Schools are not opening right now. At least, we don't expect them to, for the smaller children, open right away. Parents are under tremendous pressure themselves. Just, keeping a toddler in front of a screen for a class is impossible, while also having to deal with your own work and your own commitments that you have to your own office. What would parents normally have to do? Even if you know that your child is communicating this to you, how do you respond to that communication?
And I think therein lies the challenge, right? And I say this about myself, and I know I echo so many parents' voice when I say I'm the worst version of a mom that I am today than I ever thought I would be, because you're just surviving. You're not, sometimes there isn't very much you can do. There are those evenings you can sit down and talk about it. More often than not, you're saying sorry to your child at night before, as you put them to bed. I'm sorry I was this way. I'm sorry I snapped at you. I know this is hard. You're apologizing a lot more. I think this is where I believe there has to be a more concerted effort by the government as well, put into how are you going to open up for these children? And yes, we understand, you're not going to be able to send them back to school, but something in small groups and, in little groups. And that's the effort I know a lot of parents are making to say, how can we get little pods of children together to be able to provide them some sense of a physical interaction, because in the early years, their learning is all about interacting with somebody else. It's, like you said, sitting online is not even close to ideal, but we did find that it helped. It helped to see other friends, it helped to talk. And I think creating safe spaces for children to say anything is very important. And children have no filter, so they'll say it, right? And you have to be able to give them that space to say it and not gasp and ooh and ah about it, and allow them to talk about it. And I think we need to start working towards how are we going to give children a little bit of normalcy. I know it's not going to be 100%, but that really has to be a priority as communities.
Smriti?
Yes. Helen, thank you. I'm going to put this through a palliative care lens again, because I mean, that's what I do. But I feel like you've touched upon something that is so vital. And when we in palliative care, we have this idea of, who is the invisible patient. You have the index patient who has the diagnosis and all the physical symptoms and all the physical struggles, but who is the invisible patient in the household? And very often it is either the elderly person at home, or very, very often the child, who is assumed to not understand what is going on, who is assumed to not feel grief the same way that adults feel it. In fact, a few minutes before we started this webinar, we just concluded a session on children and grief. And how do children respond to it? And I often find that, it's very refreshing to hear you speak about it with so much candor, because I find that oftentimes it is our discomfort with a topic that also, is the biggest barrier. And like you said, children have no filters. So it's incumbent on us to really find the vocabulary that they understand, figure out what sort of developmental stage they're at. And we were talking about this an hour ago, where you can't talk to a 6-year-old about like the frameworks and stages of grief, right? You have to actually understand what they're trying to tell you without using the words. And so much of it is in their body language and in their behavior. And what is sometimes interpreted as a tantrum could very well be their way of expressing grief. And but it's also so much harder now when all the pressures are on the family and on mothers and on fathers and on people just cramped into little spaces where they have to just live out their entire lives in front of one another. So that's a hidden voice for sure. And then you brought it to the forefront so articulately. Thank you very much. Faye.
Well, if we actually look at what our three guests have told us in their experience, and it really sort of brings together this idea of sort of silent suffering that we've seen in the pandemic, or outside of the, or maybe suffering that has been sort of aggravated by the pandemic. And I want to go back to what we were talking about, the elderly, people who are living alone, people who are cut off from family because family can't travel, family can't visit, elderly people who are now not just responsible to run their own homes, to look after their own health, to find their own medication, to make sure that their food is cooked, but also to find emotional solace somehow, because they've lost the satsang, they've lost the evening park gathering, they've lost their social circles as well, that they would use to sort of talk about what's going on in their lives, with their children, with their grandchildren, and make things a little lighter, maybe easier once they share it. What's happening there? What solutions are there? How can we be more sensitive to the suffering of elderly? Dr. Alka, Ganesh? Dr. Ganesh, can you hear me?
Yeah, one thing that has been sadly very, very visible as a reaction of the older people is that they just didn't have any resources. And so if you look, you will find a lot of suicides among the elderly. Many of these, what I was reading is, they have actually been trying to get to a medical person because their behavior was very odd, they were depressed. So somehow they did try to get medical help, but nobody had the time to listen to people whose O2 levels were normal and, were not obviously suffering from the kind of disease that everybody was. And elderly people have so many comorbidities. So if somebody's got, if he goes to a hospital, it's, are you COVID? Are you not COVID? Even if you've got your diabetes bad, is it COVID or not COVID? And this kind of a yes-no situation made the elderly's diseases and suffering so much more acute. And coming to not considered at all, even as a matter of normal life, the mental health of elderly is the medical profession who are non-psychiatrists. They don't know that attached to the body, there is a mind, you see, because we only are taught, even in medicine, I'm sorry to say this, but that, your body is like a car. And if you're having we find that carburetor that is not working, but if anything like that, it could be something that your mind is not able to wrap around. So in the pandemic, what has happened is the number of elderly suicides has actually gone up. And in general, older people's suicide levels are much higher. Of course, the highest level is in adolescent countries, but after that, it tends to come down, and then it's steadily going up in the above 60s and 70s age group. And that tells a lot about the fact that there are no safety nets. We have to find, as a solution, we have to find those safety. So I'm talking about a non-COVID time when we thought of this problem about 10 years ago, and we said, elderly people need to have somebody who are willing to listen to them, and a third party might be easier for them to talk to than somebody in the family. So of course, that's all that we can't talk about in the COVID times. But at that time, we thought the community, there may be some people in the community. Now you find this in the West a lot where they don't have families. So the community can get mobilized. But we set out a call, 40 to 50 people in their 40s and 50s who were very happy to be trained in how to look after elderly people. And so we were teaching them, when you have a person who's hearing impaired, how would you talk to that person? How would you make him feel included? Because he is the most lonely person in the family. He looks happy, he's eating all right, but he's not included in any conversation. If a wedding is to be planned, he's not asked, should we have this and what should we have in the sapad and this thing, because it's too difficult to talk to this older person. So that exclusion from whole of family life is a very sore point for older people. And, so we thought that maybe we could get this band of people who pledged 1 hour a week. If they were called on a Wednesday, if they booked for 2 to 3 p.m., we could call them and say, hey, needs your help over there because they're going shopping and, this old man is going to be left by himself and he might need a diaper change. So of community support. Now, that is very difficult, I fear, in an Indian context, because we have so many partitions in our society. If I'm a person, will I be going to that kind of person's house? A stranger will come? That was my fear. But when you actually got these people together, they were quite willing. I said, would you mind going into certain people's houses? He said, no, we'd be quite happy because we feel as though we're doing something. So it's an untapped resource in our communities. Of course, during COVID, everything changes and we have to, but I think as a group of people who want to do things, especially for elderly, we have to get some kind of support, and they can be very good for mental health. I just want to, I don't want to take your time. was there. But one example from when I was in the UK, I wanted to see how old people are in their communities. It was in the 1990s. And so one general practitioner took me to a lady who was on an oxygen concentrator because she had very bad lungs. And I asked her, how do you live all alone? She said, on the surface, it looks as though I'm very well off because during the war, I had no food to eat and no this. Now I have all the food, this thing. But I have nobody to talk to. I have one daughter who doesn't want to talk to me. And then I've got this telephone book, and you see these red lines. They were all the people I was talking to, and they all died. And so, by the way, it's now 3 o'clock, she said, and my university student, it's time for her. She comes on. If you don't mind, would you please kind of leave? Is what. So this old lady by herself, the only support she had was this university student. So we do have that here. We have a doctor grandparent and all that. Some universities, some colleges do have that. Thinking an extension of that to bring some kind of association, and the chai kade, you know, the people in the villages, they will go to the chai kade and they can say, they can't go to the chai kade. Maybe kade can come to them in the form of a younger person. So I think we need to develop all these things when it's easier. Not now, I think. Yes. And how about Helen, if I can ask you, you know, I've been very interested in this gender bridging. You know, an old person can have so many stories. And if they could go to a school and give, you know, 1 hour is for grandpa's time and tell a story. So in fact, when I was doing some research collecting data on an elderly in a village, one person said, you know, I was I used to perform before I became 70, and I can still sing. And so I said, well, why can't you go and do something in the school? He said, that's a good idea, but it didn't gel. It didn't work out. So I think we need to work on those.
Actually, I was just going to jump in and say, we found actually that marrying with the grandparent, you know, something wonderful that came around because they were lonely and, you know, they hadn't seen their grandchildren. They were all separated. And we suggested to a few parents, why don't you use Zoom and get them together? And it's been wonderful and therapeutic for both because really they just both wanted attention, the youngest and the oldest. They wanted someone to listen to them without judgment. And really that pairing of a 5-year-old with a 70, 60, 70, 80-year-old is wonderful, right? We've encouraged them to read stories. So there's story time that happens, a grandmother reading a story to her granddaughter, or seeing the cats and the dogs because they all lived far away, right? And that's been quite wonderful. It's of course not ideal, but definitely that marrying, I think, of the grandparents with the grandchildren, because they both felt heard and they both felt like
it need not be your biological grandfather.
Absolutely.
So that's something we should work on.
Yes. And we have had them come to the school as well and spend mornings with them and, you know, cook with them and take them through, give them stories. And that it's a wonderful relationship to see develop.
I just wanted to come in for a second and talk about the fact that last year, around this time is when we conceived of the Sukh Dukh helpline, which is something that Pallium India runs in collaboration with 3 other partners, Caregiver Sathi. And Caregiver Sathi is an organization that literally like walks with caregivers and helps them navigate the caregiving journey. And there's Mind India, which is headed by Dr. Sangeeta Goswami, also a CMC Vellore person, Dr. Alka, based out of the Northeast, Kumam, and so a lot of dots to join there. But she runs a fantastic organization called Mind India, and there's Utsav Mishra, who's also a counselor. The idea of this helpline was not initially; it was grief and bereavement. It was for people who were losing people to COVID and didn't have avenues to grieve. But over the last year, it has really evolved into an emotional support helpline, and I think the beauty of it is that it is available in 8 languages. Including Assamese and Telugu and Kannada and all of that. And we have it's run entirely by volunteer counselors, but these are counselors with the credentials they're trained counselors. They're giving us their time as community members. Each of them, gives us a few hours a week, and they're available from Monday through Saturday for anybody to just call in and talk about things that are distressing them. So if it is something very serious like suicide risk and stuff, of course, we will guide them to more appropriate helplines. But I think it is, and Faye, this is where I'm going to ask you also to come in. It's not really in our culture, really, is it, to pick up the phone and talk to a stranger? But when we're all cooped together in our houses, we can't really talk to one another. And there's also multiple losses where everybody's experienced the grief. So nobody's really in a position to help the other one out. And we've lost community in the sense of like not having that social freedom. What is your take on, this being an avenue for seeking help? Because it is something new to our culture, isn't it? To pick up the phone and call and tell somebody how you're feeling. You're on mute.
So I think that, one of the challenges I've come across is that a lot of people are feeling some kind of distress, anxiety, and we tend to believe that we can walk it off. I'll go for a run, or I'll exercise, or, I'll make myself a good meal and I'll somehow start to feel better. Because in India, we also, we're told from the time we're very young not to talk about ourselves. It's not polite to talk about yourself, right? So it's not polite to focus on your grief, but to focus on your pain when everybody in your country is going through so much worse. So people are so much, this is again, there's something that we were told from the time we were small, right? Children are starving in this country. How can you not eat your vegetables? People are so poor. Everybody's having a worse time than you. How can you possibly be complaining? And so I think we internalize that at some point, and we tend to sort of push it down and say, I'm not as bad off as other people. So why am I complaining? I should just move on with it. I think that keeps us from doing what you're saying, which is reaching out for help, recognizing that we need to somehow reach out to a friend, family, stranger, whoever that is, and just say, hey, listen, this is what I'm feeling. Is this normal? Am I going through something? Do I need stronger help in some way? Because it's that, it's that sense of, I need to talk to someone about this that I think we're missing. And because we're missing it, a lot of times there's, we're missing help that might be there.
Absolutely.
Which we're just not asking for.
Yeah.
And what's amazing, I've spent the last year.
Absolutely.
I spent the last year talking to psychiatrists who are offering help for free, organizations who are building networks of help for free. All over the country, there are people doing amazing work. But unless we can convince the people around us to ask for help and convince them that they won't be shamed for asking for help in any way, that nobody's going to turn around and say, oh, look at you, you have everything, you have a nice house. Like, do you remember in the first wave, there was this whole, you have a house with a bedroom to yourself. Look at the people who have to walk on the road because there's nowhere for them to go. They have no place to quarantine. They have no, you have a bathroom, you have a house, you have food on the table, you haven't lost your job. What's your problem? We need to come out of that, because I've realized, unfortunately, that it doesn't matter how many, grief counseling, grief groups, this, that, whatever it is you're working on, unless we tell people that they need to talk about what they're going through, all of this effort is going to waste because nobody is reaching out. And I don't know, honestly, I don't know the solution to that problem. I don't know how to get people to reach out. There's a generational issue as well. You have young people who are reaching out, older people who say, these young people are just complaining about that. This is the Simone Biles argument, right? You're just complaining. This generation doesn't know what to do with its emotions. It's because of social media. It's because of this. It's because of that. So if your parents or your seniors in the office or whoever else doesn't acknowledge your pain, you're going to be tempted to keep it inside. You're going to be tempted to, at the end of the day, even all psychiatrists will tell you that you need a support system when you're being treated for whatever it is you're being treated for. If you're going through grief, anxiety, depression, or any more serious things, that you need someone that you can call and say, hey, today I'm having a bad day. But if we're too embarrassed to tell anybody, then what are we going to do? So I don't know the solution to this problem. I know that there is a lot of help out there. I know people have done amazing work in setting up help structures. I just don't know how to get fellow Indians to reach out. And this, we're talking about people who have access to social media, people who may be watching this show. We're not even talking to those who need help in Kannada, in Tamil, in Marathi, in Bengali. How are we going to reach them? I see Dr.
Because you mentioned social media twice. I'm not somebody who, my generation doesn't go onto Facebook. But what is the impact of Facebook on, will be the impact? Could that be used rather than a helpline? And how would it be? Because Facebook is not as, from what I understand, is not as private as.
It's not. But at least, maybe someone's hearing this conversation. To some extent, we convince them to reach out.
Can we imagine that it can be used in a way? I don't know, you people who think about this a lot. Can Facebook be used? Can there be scenarios? Can there be videos to show actual interviews? Not on Facebook, but I don't know. I'm just thinking, as an educationist, I feel that, there's no point in teaching somebody how to do this, in giving a theory how to do this thing. They must actually apply it. So are there mock we can do? I don't know. I'm just.
I wonder if there are videos that we can put out in multiple languages telling people how to recognize if someone in your immediate circle is going through distress of an emotional kind. How do you know if the 3 people or 4 people you're currently sharing your home with, you've been locked up with for the last year and a half, if one of them is emotionally distressed, do we know what we're looking for? Is there any way to be able to tell that? And once you spot it, what do you do with that knowledge now that you know? How do you treat that carefully? What do you say to that person? Maybe there's something we can do. Helen?
I think that's something through this last year that sort of we've all learned is that sense of community, right? It's the people in our building or the people on our road that have become most important to us. I have a friend who lost her husband this year, and something she taught me through her grief journey was just holding space. And I think, again, that's sort of cultural in our context. When someone tells us their problems, we believe we have to have solutions for them handy immediately, or we have to try and justify why their situation's maybe not as bad as it is. But maybe it's just about trying as a community to listen to each other, not have to give that solution. And that could be that first step of healing in some sense. And I don't know, again, I don't have that solution on how you're going to sort of bring this change about. But I do know culturally we sort of rush to solution mode faster than just listening.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going to be mindful of the time. I think we're just sort of warming up to this conversation and we could go another 2 hours. But I just wanted to come back to Kumam once, because we're talking about community. We're talking about relying on community resources. Kumam, I'm very mindful of the fact that what we call community resources is not something that is readily available to the LGBTQI community. And one of the things that strikes me, especially in a time like COVID, when there has been so much mortality and death, is about the disenfranchised grief of people in the community who are unable to grieve for the ones they love and their partners because society doesn't give them sanction to. And what has been your experience of that? And I'm going to ask you, I mean, it's a very heavy question, but I'd really love to hear your take on that. And after you, there's one more question before we start wrapping up. I know everybody has is pressed for time. Kumam.
Yeah, so I remember, as you ask, just 2 months back, a very popular trans girl from Manipur died, and it was in Imphal, the capital city, the city where trans visibility is more than elsewhere. So she died of XYZ reasons, and I and a couple of friends from the community, we went to offer flowers in the evening, in the late evening. And after her death, during the process of the funeral, her mother cried, addressing her as son and not as a daughter or a woman. The locality address, the locality mourn over her death as the death of their sons, their son, and not a woman. And the trans girls who were there during the funeral, I think were shocked for life that, okay, is this what happened to us after we die? Even after that, even after they die, or whatever, deaths which are often associated with shame and disease and, taboo and stigma. So is this what we get reduced to? Just a man, just a boy, at the end of the day, even from my own parents, even at the time of death. So, and, during the process of the funerals, a few trans girls came to me and said, okay, is this what is going to happen to us? And if this is what is going to happen to us, likely then we don't really see a point of living as such. And yeah, I mean, this is what I can think of right now. And I think in the beginning when I said, I don't know how to articulate grief for us, I think now I can, because I think in the last 45 minutes, I think after having listened and processed some of my thoughts, and I really realized that, I mean, grief for us is really one of shame, being shame even after death. One of being shame, one of being invisible, one of being misrepresented, and of everyday violence for us. And I think we indeed have a lot to grieve, from Section 377 to HIV epidemic to everyday violence, and maybe perhaps a little less from COVID-19, because COVID-19 is widely acknowledged. The pain in COVID-19 is acknowledged. There's no shame in dying from COVID-19. There's no shame, at least. But there is so much shame for the trans community. There's so much shame for people living with HIV if they die. So I think it's really one of shame and invisibility. And Smriti, I think I can just cite this one example, and this one example represents many other examples. Yeah. So this is what I can think of right now.
Thank you, Kumam. Thank you so much. And one last question before we start winding down. There are a lot of questions in the chat box, but I'm so sorry we don't have the time, because this is an important question and it's directed at Faye. Faye, for many of us, you are our torchbearer, and you have grown to be. And I say this, I've known you for years, so I'm not here to give you any platitudes like that. But you have become a symbol of reporting with integrity and like journalism with integrity. And while the rest of us have the luxury and the privilege of turning off the news when it gets too much, you don't. And you're called to bear witness to every atrocity, every sadness, every conflict, every bit of violence. And you do that because it's who you are, and you do it well, and you do it for all of us. I want to ask you, Faye, what is it like? How does a reporter like you process the grief of having to witness that day in, day out, and not be able to turn away?
So actually, I used to, before the pandemic, my emotional reaction was mostly of frustration and anger when something would and invariably the thing that would sort of get the worst reaction, the most sort of visceral reaction out of me would be crime against women and children of a sexual nature. It would just frustrate me to an extent where I've lost my cool a couple of times. But during the second wave of the pandemic, when I had sort of, and it was so weird because I was home and I had made a conscious decision during the second wave not to step out of the house. I had stepped out of the house and reported from the field a lot in the first wave. In the second wave, I just somehow internally decided that if there is a risk that either I or one of my team members might die of this, then I'm not going to do it. It's just, we're going to do it from home. We're going to figure out how to do our best from home, but I'm not going to risk a life and put pressure on the system even further by stepping out. So we were home, but I remember for the first time in a 17-year career, weeping when reading information about bodies floating, about, in the river, about people throwing their family members off bridges because they couldn't afford funerals, about loved ones. And then at night, I would be up almost all night because I was getting random phone calls from people who sourced my number in the hope that I might be able to get them remdesivir, or I might be able to get them a bed in a hospital. I might be able to get them oxygen in Lucknow, in Meerut, in Delhi. And I'm sitting in Mumbai. I mean, there was this one night when I stayed up from midnight till 3 in the morning because a children's hospital in Delhi, one of the largest children's hospitals in Delhi, was calling me saying, we're running out of oxygen, can you help us? I'm in another city. I'm not in any way an official person linked to government. I'm a private citizen. This short of just making phone calls and tweeting about it, there's very little that I can do, but this is how desperate the situation got. And it would drive me to tears on a regular basis. I had team members who already had issues that they were working through with mental health. And it reached a point where they had relapses. They had episodes. They had to drop out and quit the job because their therapist told them, you can no longer work in news. It's not healthy. You're not equipped to handle this kind of information. And this is just, we're a 7-member team now. We were I can't imagine what happened in large newsrooms where, people are invisible, where, your team leader is not watching every single person, not making sure that everyone's okay when we go home at night. It was heartbreaking in a way that I can't, and one of the reasons why we do the news, I do the news the way I do on a nightly basis, is to spare the audience the pain. So I'm not, as opposed to what would otherwise a news channel do, which is show you that same visual on loop over and over and over and over and over again. We said, hey, you know what? Let's find a way to tell you what happened without upsetting you emotionally. Let's find a way to communicate that information without manipulating your emotions and stressing you out, or causing more anxiety to people who are obviously already suffering silently in the country. And that's the way we came up with that format of let's just read it like Doordarshan and not, try as far as possible not to upset you. And if there is something upsetting, I actually tell people to stop watching. Don't watch any further. Don't watch this video. It's going to upset you. But we barely survived. There are days, Smriti, when I put away my phone. I just say, and I've given my team, and a lot of people find this odd. Just 2 days ago, someone gave me feedback saying it's a terrible idea. I've given my team Saturday and Sunday off. We don't do the news on Saturday and Sunday because we won't survive if we did it every day of the week. We won't survive if we don't take a couple of days off in order to cleanse what we have gone through over the last, 5 days. And that's just the pandemic. But when you're reading about bangle sellers who get beaten up because of their religion, when you read about government taking, advantage, stirring up religious sentiment, I've reached a point now where I no longer tweet at all. Because I just think that Twitter is a toxic wasteland. No good can come of it at this point. I do not put out my opinion on Twitter because I can't handle the response. I'm just not strong enough anymore to listen to what people say to me. So I read what's happening, I process it for the bulletin, but I no longer put out my opinion at all because I just don't have the emotional energy to fight it out anymore. And there are days when, I just shut down thinking, if this is what we are going to be as a people, if this is who we are, then what are we fighting for? There's a climate change report that tells us most of our coastal cities will be underwater in 20 years. 20 years. Smriti and I met 20 years ago. It's not that, it's not such a long period of time. 20 years. That, the Himalayas will lose all the snow that they have. The Geriatric plains will either be flooded or completely dry in 20 years. But we don't care. And we just go on, doing these petty things about religion and I don't know what else we're fighting about. It's so distressing. It's so distressing that even though I make a living off it, half the time I want people to just switch off and, take a nap, take a walk, go look at the sky. Because I don't know what the future is going to hold. And I don't know, how we're going to get there. And I do hope that we're going to find a way to sort of reach out and help each other out because it's really bleak if you're not going to be able to do that. It's really, really bleak. For the children that Helen is working for right now, what are we building for them? What are we leaving for them? We're custodians of the earth, we're custodians of the water, the sky, the snow, the animals, the constitution, the country. What are we doing? She's going to get them to age 18, and what are we going to hand over at that age? It's shocking to me. Sorry, you triggered something. I don't know. I don't remember what the question was anymore.
No, this is exactly why we love you. And no, it's an act of immense courage to also come and be vulnerable on a public platform about your grief, and I couldn't be more grateful for it, because very often I think we look for heroes, and this is that Mr. Rogers thing, like always look for the helpers, always look for the helpers. But again, that was said in the context of little children, way back in the 30s. I personally feel that be a helper, I mean, and do your bit, because and this is what we do, Faye. We make a superhero out of you also, and today you also showed us how human you are, so I can't thank you enough for that. I really wish we had more time to talk, because what we really pulled together today are all these different threads: the elderly, the children, the LGBTQI community, the reporters who I feel also have to go through so much disenfranchised grief. You're not allowed to grieve what you see. All of us in healthcare. There are many, many, many invisible faces of grief today. We perhaps just looked at a few of them, but I hope what this conversation has really done for everybody is, it's brought home to me, at least, the fact that it's in community that our salvation lies, and we need to look out for one another. There are resources available. There are ways for us to join the dots. And while we wait on governance and policy and all of those things to fall in line, there's nothing stopping us from really being there for one another. Grief is a natural response to a loss, is what the textbooks say. But there is nowhere does it say that somebody has to go through it alone and to suffer, things that they don't need to suffer. So thank you all very, very much for today. We have gloriously overshot by 12 minutes. I think we could have gone another 45. But I'm just going to do a quick round the room for just last closing comments. Alka, can I start with you?
Okay. Well, it was an eye-opener for me to listen to Helen about children, because somehow I'm not in close proximity with them, but I know I have allied health students, and every day I take Zoom classes for them, and it is so hard for them. So I'm going to have to reinvent myself and see how I can teach people who are just past their child. And hearing from Kumam about the LGBT community was an eye-opener and very interesting. And Faye and Smriti, of course, very good. And I'm happy that we can, I think from people what they have said on the chat box, that they are also thinking, and it sparked a lot of information. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thanks, Alka. Helen.
Thank you, Smriti and Faye, for having this conversation. I think that, to go and start going beyond the layers of grief equaling death is something that's not talked about enough. And I think everyone carries a lot of sadness in their hearts today, from the 1 and 2 year olds all the way to the elderly and of course all the other facets of society that Kumam brought around. So thank you for having that conversation. I think it's been amazing to learn from.
Thank you. Kumam.
Well, I mean, I like to, I usually like to think that I know enough about other people, especially women, especially children and older people. But thank you, Helen and, Alka, for making me realize that actually I don't know enough, and there's always, there's always more to learn and, gain new perspectives. And also great to have, like have like sort of interacted with Faye also, big fan here. And I think this will be an ongoing conversation, because I think with one conversation, it usually sort of, remains very isolated. So yeah, I hope that this will be an ongoing conversation. Thank you.
And my dear friend Faye, I'm going to leave this with you.
if you'd allow me the room to just put out one message, right? I think that we're a very hardworking, ambitious country and a very hardworking, ambitious people. And we're talking about double-digit growth and how, GDP and all of these things. And we're constantly like moving forward. And we get very upset when someone stands in our way. But as a result, what we've done is that we've cut out any sort of weakness at all. We have no room in our workplaces for women who are caring for small children or women who are caring for elderly. We have no place in our lives for anyone who's slower than us. If they have a disability of some sort, or if they have a challenge or a learning challenge, or they're caring for someone who has a challenge, which we tend to say, hey, we don't have room for this because we're working really hard, we're moving really forward, and we're going to just make spaces where nobody can have a weakness. Because we have that luxury as a country to just leave people behind. And our cities are designed like that. Our spaces are designed like that. Our public places are designed like that. We just leave people behind. We expect them to be out of our peripheral vision so we can just focus on moving forward. And I think that this is one thing the pandemic has taught us, or should have taught us, is that we're all members of the walking wounded in some way or the other. We're all caring for the wounded in some way or the other, some emotionally, some physically, some in other ways. And we need to find ways to slow down and listen to the ones around us and give other people time to listen to us, and maybe bring in elements of, empathy and concern and care, and not just care for what other people have to say, what's going on in their lives and what's happening in their stories, but also give people room to care for you. And be vulnerable, allow somebody to care for you. You don't have to be strong, and you don't have to hold it together all the time, and you don't have to be an example to your children of how you can never fall apart. And I know people who have lost spouses, parents, loved ones, who are holding it together now for a year and a half because they don't want their children to see their vulnerability, because they're all in the house and the children are never going to school. So what are you going to do? Weep in the bathroom. And we've done this to ourselves now, where we're just now, I think, holding on by our fingernails. And I don't know how much longer we can, hold it together. I think that vulnerability is really important at this point for all of us. Just show your children that you are human. Show your colleagues that you are human. Show your teammates that you're human, especially if you're a leader in any way, in any capacity. Just show that it's okay to be human and make room. Because maybe we won't hit GDP for the next 2 years, but if we make it together, linked arms, I think that's the important thing right now.
Thank you, Faye. Thank you. That is a nice, that's a clarion call, and it's a one to be gentle and vulnerable and to slow down, really. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank all our panelists for making the time today, and there are many questions in the chat box, which I just want to say that there are questions about what we're going to do about various things. This was a conversation just to talk about grief, just to to expand our horizons about what grief feels like for people in various situations. So I'm sorry that we haven't had the time to answer a lot of your questions, and some of them really I wouldn't even know how to answer them. But thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Faye, thank you, Dr. Alka, thank you, Helen, thank you, Kumam. With that, we're going to close this session for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.